Mrs. Patricia was known in her neighborhood for her wealth and extravagant lifestyle, but also for her cruel temper. She lived in a large mansion and employed several staff members, but none faced her wrath more than her housemaid, Grace, a quiet young woman who had come from a poor background to work for her. From the moment Grace stepped into the household, Mrs. Patricia treated her harshly. She demanded perfection, often making Grace work late into the night cleaning, cooking, and running errands. If anything was even slightly out of place, Mrs. Patricia would shout and threaten to fire her. Grace endured it all in silence, knowing she had no other means to support her family. One evening, after a particularly harsh scolding, Grace sat outside the house, wiping her tears. An older neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had seen how Grace was treated, approached her. "Don't let her cruelty define you, dear," Mrs. Thompson said kindly. "Kindness will always prevail, even if it's not seen right away." Grace nodded but found it hard to believe. However, she continued to do her work diligently, despite the harshness she faced daily. Months passed, and one day, Mrs. Patricia received news that shocked her. A sudden financial crisis hit her husband's business, and their fortune evaporated almost overnight. Her once grand lifestyle collapsed, and many of her staff left, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. But Grace stayed, despite everything she had endured. With no one else to rely on, Mrs. Patricia began to see Grace in a different light. She realized that, despite all her cruelty, Grace had remained loyal. One evening, broken and humbled, Mrs. Patricia approached her. "I don't deserve your kindness after all I've done," she admitted with a tremble in her voice. Grace simply smiled and said, "We all make mistakes, ma'am. It's never too late to change." From that day on, Mrs. Patricia's attitude toward Grace changed completely. She treated her with the respect she had long deserved, and in the process, learned that kindness and humility were far more valuable than wealth or power. The experience transformed Mrs. Patricia, and the bond between her and Grace grew stronger, proving that even the coldest heart can soften when shown a little warmth.